Hello and welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast. I am your host, Meghan McCarthy. We are grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you today as we talk about the complexities of giftedness. Today we're excited to welcome Lora, Dudek from the OCD and Anxiety Center, as well as welcome Dr. Maha Zayed back to the Gifted Ed podcast. Dr. Maha Zayed is a licensed clinical psychologist and owner of the OCD and Anxiety Center.
But I think a lot of kids go unnoticed, especially probably in the gifted population, because it looks good, right? They're getting straight A's, They're in 15 sports and excelling at every single one of them. And so you don't really recognize that might be driven by anxiety because the outcome is okay.
She specializes in working with teens, kids, and adults who struggle with anxiety, OCD, and anxiety-related disorders. She provides cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure-based therapy and has had the privilege of seeing people get back to living happier, healthier lives where anxiety and OCD are managed in a relatively short amount of time. Lora Dudek holds a master's in counseling psychology and is a therapist at the OCD and Anxiety Center, who specializes in treating anxiety, OCD, and OCD-related disorders.
When we are engaged, and when we are engaged in something that's meaningful to us, perhaps value-based, right, that we are doing the thing that anxiety says don't do because you might be judged, then you're showing anxiety. When you're not avoiding these things and you're stepping towards them, you're showing this part of your brain that wants to throw up the flares and say this is going to be really, really bad, that actually I can handle what's going on.
She has worked with children, adolescents, and adults in private practice, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient settings. Welcome, Maha and Lora, to the Gifted Ed podcast. Maha, we're so excited to have you back and introduce Lora to our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's start talking about anxiety. It truly encompasses so much, and it seems like the more we kind of dive in and learn more about anxiety, the umbrella kind of gets bigger and bigger of all the things that are held under it. So I'd love to start our conversation by talking through some of the various forms of anxiety or how maybe they surface differently in our individuals that we're working with, whether it's school refusal or social anxiety or performance anxiety. Like there's so many different types. So I was hoping we could kind of just start generally talking through some of those.
Yeah, sure. So we see a lot of different types of anxiety, especially in our teenagers. The most common ones, I would say, are school anxiety, social anxiety, general anxiety, OCD, perfectionism, I think would be the most common ones. And I want to take a step back and just kind of give you the basic framework of anxiety. And then from there, you can plug in the different types of anxieties and you can kind of understand it like that. And so the way that we see anxiety is that we see a trigger, right? Whether the trigger be a symptom, a thought, a feeling, a situation, a person. So for example, a situation might be a teacher calls on me in class, right? Mm-hmm. From there, then there's a thought. Always. Mm-hmm. There's always a thought. And so the thought might be something like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get made fun of, or people are going to judge me, or I'm not going to know what to say, or I'm going to freeze. Mm-hmm. And usually the thought is something catastrophic or an overestimation of threat, something threatening, right? And from there, there's a feeling, and the feeling is anxiety, so heightened anxiety. And then from there, there's a behavior. And usually the behavior is some sort of escape or some sort of a coping or accommodation or something to lessen the anxiety, right? And so that's the cycle. And that's how anxiety occurs. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to think about what shows up in teens, social anxiety, I kind of gave you the example is, teacher calls on me, I'm going to get made fun of, I feel anxious, and now I don't want to raise my hand anymore, or I don't want to go to school, or I don't want to talk to anybody, right? And then that behavior maintains the anxiety. Yeah. So general worries like I'm going to take a test, and the thought might be I'm going to fail, I'm not going to get into college, I'm going to be homeless, right? The catastrophe. Yeah. And then the feeling is anxious. And so then the behavior is I'm either going to overstudy for a lot of hours or I'm going to avoid it altogether, right? And so you can fit most anxieties into this cycle. Yeah. Is that kind of what you see?
Yes. I mean, I think everything is anticipatory, right? Everything is before. Nothing is rarely actually in the moment. And I think in the moment, if you're performing, you're generally the anxiety is lower to the point. Like it's just the amount of pressure, I guess, ahead of time is always so large. And then obviously if we don't have the coping skills, we do as humans whatever we need to reduce that pressure.
Right.
Ideally, if we have healthy coping skills, those are healthy strategies to reduce that pressure. But yes, I would say for the most part, the anticipatory, and I'm always interested with school refusal, like kind of most students who have school refusal, once they're here,
right,
they perform really well from the outside, I should say, right? Like what's going on the inside is always a question mark sometimes, but it's the anticipation of whatever that first trigger is that they're thinking about.
And I think that what you're speaking to, what you just touched on, talks to the biology of anxiety, which I think is really important to remember, that at the end of the day, anxiety is something that is meant to help us.
Right.
That is a part of our brain that is sourcing out fear and these triggers that might need to, evoke fight or flight. And so that's a really big part of understanding, of course, where it comes from, but then also how we get to respond to it.
Yeah.
Right. So when we have that understanding, it's just it leads us into a different conversation about then why is this coming up? Where is it showing up? How are we able then to manage it when it's there?
Yeah. And I think what you like the education piece with the biology, because I think too when it's framed as anxiety really helps us too, right? Like
Absolutely.
It is what prompts us to study for tests. It's what prompts us to look both ways when we cross the street. I mean, granted, that's just a routine that parents always try to instill in their kids. Right. But it's the worry of I'm going to get hurt, so I'm going to look both ways. So it has such wonderful value, but obviously when that gets when it's not right sized, right? When it's larger than the actual worry.
We kind of talk about a false alarm, like a fire alarm, right? The fire alarm is going off. It's a ginormous threat when most people would see it as a neutral stimuli or something not as threatening.
Yep.
And you're right. In terms of anticipation, that's what we see is the worst, the anticipatory. And I think it's really anxiety is a fear of the unknown, right?
Yes.
So it's the anticipation, it's the unknown. But once you're in school, it's like all the worries that you had are right there. You're aware of it, so it's not as scary. You're able to deal with it.
And I will say, obviously, I'm a school social worker, but I am too a parent. Sitting with your child when they are anxious is it's a very difficult task to do. And it is so uncomfortable to sit there when you are just simply trying to be present with your kid who's trying to sit with anxiety.
Right.
But sometimes learning to sit with something uncomfortable is something to reduce our response to those triggers too, because there are going to be uncomfortable things we just have to sit with. We can't just go straight to a device or straight to an avoidant behavior too.
Right. And that speaks to the overestimation of threat and our underestimation of the ability to handle it at the end of the day is what anxiety looks like. So it's uncomfortable. Yeah. It's really uncomfortable.
Like us too, right?
Everyone can agree with that for parents who are watching their children and for children who are feeling it. Yeah. But also to what you said, which is that the anticipatory anxiety, takes over sometimes. It can feel really scary. Anxiety only lives in the future. Yeah. Like if we're boiling this down, anxiety lives in the future. If we are doing something in this moment, we're actively coping. Even if we're feeling anxious, we are somehow coping with it, right? So understanding even that part of anxiety, that when we are engaged and when we are engaged in something that's meaningful to us, perhaps value-based, right, that we are doing the thing that anxiety says don't do because you might be judged, then you're showing anxiety. When you're not avoiding these things and you're stepping towards them, you're showing this part of your brain that wants to throw up the flares and say this is going to be really, really bad, that actually I can handle what's going on.
Yeah. Anxiety lives in the future. That's a very eloquent way of whatever I was trying to say a few minutes prior when it's like if you're actually able to sit and take the test, like you're managing, you're present in the moment. But even the idea of being present is a challenge for our brains in this day and age,
Absolutely.
too. So that is only going to increase anxiety. Okay, so we've talked about generally as a whole, and we've touched on children, adolescents, and adults, but does it surface, or how do you see it in your practice, anxiety surfacing differently in different age groups?
Yeah, I think in younger kids, we tend to see more separation anxiety, more fears about parents, more fears about death, more worries about harm to loved ones in adults and teens too, but it's more like my parents are going to die, I'm going to be alone, that sort of thing. Okay. We also see, I would say, a lot more physical complaints and tantrums. Yeah. So like younger kids aren't able, even teens, like they're not able to share, I'm feeling anxious or I'm worried or I'm scared. It's more, I have a headache, I have a bellyache, I don't feel good, or just tantrums, crying, screaming, yelling. And oftentimes that's not being oppositional or bad, or it's more like an anxiety of some sort. So we see a lot of that in the younger kids. Yep. I'd say in teens we tend to see a lot more unhealthy coping, like devices, screens, substances, more school. We see a lot of school refusal, school anxiety, just avoidance of whatever is challenging or difficult. In adults, we see that as well, but less, I would say less of like, we don't see a ton of like work avoidance, right? Like they're doing the things, they just might be really struggling through it, or avoiding socializing, or avoiding their personal life or relationships.
And I wonder if with adults, the consequences are too severe. So like, I need a paycheck.
Exactly.
Right? Where a child can just refuse school, and the consequences, they're intense, but they're not as black and white.
Right. Yeah.
But that suffering, I'm sure, then is even more acute.
And that's it. I think that adults then tend to do things much more often, like self-medicate, and to do unhelpful behaviors to kind of like ward off this anxiety that they're carrying all day. It's really heavy. Yeah. And it's really hard. Yeah. So even in adolescence, I know one thing that we see sometimes is even self-harm. Like when they start to experiment with self-harm as a means of almost escape. Yeah. Experimenting with substances. So it's important when we're seeing these kinds of things to acknowledge them. When these symptoms are left untreated, they show up as anxiety as children, as Dr. Zayed just said, like the tantrums and the emotionality. It can, after a while, produce, like low moods and symptoms that we see, loss of interest in activities. It turns into mixed anxiety and depression. Like when you're carrying this around for a while, it turns into the avoidance. And that can have a real effect then also on some depressive symptoms that can be seen.
Mm-hmm. And I think I just wanted to add one more thing. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of as a society or without any education, a lot of people think if something is hard or challenging or stressful or scary, then the best tactic is to escape it or avoid it, right? Like I grew up thinking that, right? Yeah. Like if something is scary, why would you go for it, right? Yeah. And sometimes my caregivers aided in that because I don't want my child to suffer. I'm not being a good parent, or I'm being a jerk or whatever. I want to help my kid get away from that, right? Yeah. And so I think naturally we think that growing up and as a society, and it's sometimes it's interesting, like sometimes when we speak with our parents about we want to help your child learn how to face the thing that's hard, it's sometimes like an aha moment for them. It's like a big moment, and I think that we don't see that or realize that enough, that people don't grow up thinking that you want to face the thing that's hard. Right.
I was just the last few weeks I was listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, and she worded something I think was what I'm hearing you say is mixing up or inadvertently mixing up trauma and adversity. And so if you grow up in a trauma infused environment, then obviously, yes, you don't want your child to grow up in a trauma. However, adversity is okay. And we need to, so I think that piece of too, of removing every obstacle, of removing discomfort, of removing, and I just thought that was interesting as we reflect on our own childhood, how we were raised, experiences we went through, and differentiating those two, because obviously that kind of drew the line of like, okay, this is obviously not healthy, and this is an okay experience that all kids need to have. When you were talking about how it surfaces in kids, I know anxiety, I mean, in all ages, but specifically I'm thinking children, it's so sneaky, because I feel like if their response to the anxiety is inward, is quiet, is that model, it's sometimes easier to understand it as anxiety. If it's more aggressive, if it's tantrums, if it's, more outward in nature, I think it could sometimes be mislabeled because of the discomfort it brings up in us as frustrating. And it's okay to say it's really frustrating when that's happening. And so then it looks more oppositional, defiant, or aggression, more in that sense. And getting at the root of anxiety feels a lot more complicated if it's in more of an inward representation.
And it's absolutely, it is, we can validate and normalize. It is a very frustrating experience to help support a child that is having some of those outward like tantrums and the emotional outbursts and things like that. One of the things that I like to make sure that every parent that I'm working with really understands is that, not to be way too clinical with it, but to call it, a growth opportunity for the entire family, because it truly is. I, have yet to meet a parent that comes in and is like, I'm totally comfortable with watching my child have a meltdown.
Suffer, right? It's hard.
When we're going back to the biology of some of this, I like to use the word counterintuitive when we're talking about how we're supporting children through anxious moments, because everything in us as a parent is wired to take away that discomfort, to make sure that they're feeling okay. It's genuinely evolutionary that we are keeping them okay. Right? But then it goes back to understanding what is inside of us, that we are uncomfortable with the discomfort. And it's also why it's really important that parents have their own support or their own ways to gain knowledge, even sometimes outside of just the therapy that we're doing with their child, right? Whether it's their own therapist, whether they're listening to the Gifted Ed podcast, whether they're reading on it. There are so many different resources that parents can have to understand really kind of what's going on and how to help support. But it's important, as we say, a dysregulated adult will never, ever, ever help regulate a child. And so when the child is dysregulated, what we want to make sure is that they're feeling safe and supported, and knowing that just because they're dysregulated doesn't mean we have to jump in right away and save it and take away the thing that's making them dysregulated.
And I think the school refusal, so if being in an environment from birth to 5, right before we enter kindergarten, I think heavily shapes obviously our ability to then manage in a school setting. The setting doesn't accommodate the way potentially home can because of numbers, because we're in a system and there's mutual goals and there's learning objectives and there's all these different wonderful things that happen in a school, but it's definitely not a streamline, it's a different environment than the home. But then I can see the early stages of school refusal possibly starting to set in, because school's then not a comfortable place to be, because you're kind of having to confront adversity, if you will, or feelings that you might be able to escape in other settings. And then teachers obviously have a whole slew of different students coming in with all different backgrounds and all different coping and all different, so
they have a lot on their plate.
Yes, a lot.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I think too, kind of going off of what Lora said, I also think that it's important to share that most kids, probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but 95% of the kids that we see want to do well, want to be in school, want to sleep alone, want to do the hard things they want to. It's not that they're being aggressive or oppositional or bratty or whatever they want to. It's just scary.
Which then I feel like the layers then of shame that kick in, which only makes this that much harder because they yes, exactly like you said, they want to be doing.
Yeah. So sometimes it's like we get the parents that are like, my kid is just being oppositional, or they're just so aggressive, or they don't want to, or they're terrible. And we have to reframe that thought process, right? Like they're not being terrible. They just don't have any other way to express it or put it out there right now.
Yep.
They want to.
Yeah.
They're actually
communication.
Yeah.
There you go. And they're actually doing what most adults would want to do.
I know. Yes.
When they're
Yes.
feeling really anxious, right? It actually can even be reframed in the sense that we're seeing this. We're seeing the effect that it's having on them.
Yep.
And, the child is not giving you a hard time. They are having a hard time,
Yeah.
right? So making sure we understand that while holding both, that a child can be having a hard time and it is still very difficult sometimes to work through it.
And especially, too, as the child gets older, you can feel anxious, but that doesn't excuse behavior.
Right.
Like there's still consequences to our behavior.
Yeah.
It's good to understand where it's coming from, but we live in a society, right? So there's responses to our behavior.
Sure.
Okay, so that sounds really overwhelming. Talking through what are some steps or strategies to address some of these forms of anxiety, like we previously talked about, whether school refusal or perfectionism, social anxiety, and do strategies change for students who are presenting anxious versus those who have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety, if you will?
Yeah, so I'll speak to the strategies first, and then we can come back to the clinical versus not clinical. So I think for us, it's really important to understand the thoughts that the person is having. And, if they're old enough, like I said earlier, sometimes kids aren't able to share thoughts, but maybe the parents are able to put words to it, like my child is scared that I'm going to die, or my child is scared of this test, to understand the thoughts and the behaviors, right? So what are the thoughts and then what are the behaviors? And so in terms of strategies, we like to intervene at both of those areas. So in terms of thoughts, it's identifying the stuck thoughts or the catastrophic thoughts and helping the person adapt those. So for young kids, it might not be, it's not likely that you're not going to get into college. The odds are, they don't understand like that kind of logic. It might just be something like, I can do hard things. I'm brave, right? I have a 2-year-old, and sometimes he's afraid to sleep by himself. And I know it's that, he's scared of being alone. He's scared of the dark. He's scared of monsters, whatever he's scared of. But I'm not going to logic that with him, right? I just tell him every night, you're so big and brave, right? In the morning, you're going to get some M&Ms, right? And that's good enough to help him think through it, right? And so as the child gets older, you can start to do more logic and adapt thinking. But, just something like, you can do it, you can do hard things, you're strong and brave, you've done hard things before, stuff like that, I think is a really just a basic, easy intervention. And then adapting behaviors, right? So if the behavior is escape or avoid, we want to help the person be able to do it a little bit at a time, right? So if they're completely refusing school, maybe it's just getting in the building. Maybe it's just going to the school nurse's office. Maybe it's just doing one math problem. And over time, they're going to build feeling effective, right? Effective and competent and successful, and they're going to be able to do more and draw on that. And so really it's how can we approach this a little bit at a time, even with an accommodation. Yeah. So maybe it's, I'm not going to call on you 10 times, but I'll call on you once this week. So let's practice just once, right? Or why don't you go take a break in the corner over there with the sensory toys, and then when you're done, come back and we can have you read just a sentence or something like that, right? So it's helping them feel competent by approaching the task and building the I can do it muscle.
And so one of the things that I would add to that is it's important to understand then that the work that we're doing with the parents has to do with a hefty amount of education on what support is versus accommodation.
Right.
So like Dr. Zayed was just saying, saying you can do it, right? Believing in the child, believing that they can handle this. Accommodation might be absolutely nothing bad is going to happen. there's
overpromising.
Right, exactly. That
Yeah.
you're not going to have a nightmare, that things are going to be just fine. We see that a lot and again, it's parents just not necessarily knowing, or teachers not knowing.
Right.
We want to decrease the discomfort.
Sure.
And so we are, and also, as we've mentioned before, it decreases our discomfort.
Right. Yes.
Right? Like it's us reassuring ourselves as well as our children.
Right.
So,
and it doesn't work because they don't believe it, right? They don't believe like I'm going to be 100% fine, because it's not fully true, right? Like we can't predict the future.
Or if you think about it as like riding a bike, you send a child off riding a bike and you're like, don't worry, you're not going to fall. I think most parents would look at that and be like, what? They'll probably fall, right?
Right, yeah.
Something could happen. They're
Yeah.
not just going to go off riding their bike.
Yeah.
So when we use that analogy to remember that we are supporting them through saying, I believe in you and you can handle what happens and I will be here with you, right? And we'll handle it together, even if necessary.
Yeah.
But not that something's not going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
We just believe that the risk, so something could happen, but the risk of it is smaller than what the anxiety is telling them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. So the anxiety is saying, I can't ride my bike. I can't do it. I'm going to fall. I'm going to go in the hospital. I'm going to die. I'm going to, right. And we're trying to say, we're not going to say, no, you're not going to fall, but we're going to say the likelihood of those things isn't as strong. You might fall, but we could probably cope with it, right? Yep. Or you might fall, you might be in the hospital, but the likelihood of dying is small, right? And so sharing it like that is more believable, right? Because they know, like, you're not telling the truth, Mom. Like, of course I could fall.
Yeah,
right.
When you can use that with older kids and with younger kids, like when you brought up your 2-year-old, having a 2-year-old myself, it's fascinating to watch her, because I forgot it with my older boys, how much the girl talks, but how much of that talking is processing the day and processing the things that did spook her. So like those automatic doors. I mean, this happened a month ago, dropping her off at daycare. You swipe your badge and the door automatically opens. One day it kind of started closing on her. She talks about this every morning on our drive to daycare drop off. She has, when we've talked through, the first time it was, can you hold me through it? And I picked her up right away because I was like, why am I picking, this is weird. I'm in a hurry. Yep. I'm going to pick you up and just go. And then I was like, oh my goodness, this is because one time she's walked, we go here a lot. One time it started closing on her, and the amount that she talks about it is a signal to me, this really had an impact on you. And so I can go one of two ways. I can do, some mornings it's like, we don't have time. Like I'm picking you up, we're going through, and that's okay, right? We have to give ourselves a permission of like, there's reality. I have to get to work. But also that empowering her of like, we can walk through this together, and I can stand here, just that the amount of processing. But then I think as we get older, we don't do that self-talk as much anymore. It has to be taught again. When I think when we're little, there's a lot of, whether they're doing it, I think one of my oldest definitely did it all internally. He was the quietest kid, but always you could tell he was doing it. So I feel like you can't add logic, obviously, and the probability of things. Like you can't, again, that's our children here with gifted brains. They'll go all into that, which is great. But the little ones, I think doing that processing, that self-talk and the repetition, while it can be frustrating, I think reflects that like every night you probably have to go through, you're brave, you are strong, that piece. But then I feel like it does, as it should. It's not going to keep up with age, but I think the power of self-talk too is huge.
Well, and it reflects her fully functioning little brain. That
Right.
is saying, oh, that was dangerous.
Right.
Watch out for that again.
Yeah.
And she's continuing to process it. But I think another aspect then that is really helpful when we're working with children who have anxiety is, as I've, mentioned previously, remembering that it's there for a reason.
Right.
It's there to keep us safe. And anxiety, the voice of anxiety, is extremely judgy.
Yeah.
It has to be.
Yeah.
It has to be, because it's putting things in black and white categories constantly in order to look out for us.
Yeah.
So what you were saying just reminded me of, a dose of self-compassion that is also taught when we're working with children.
Yep.
And remembering that anxiety is really nasty. That anxiety monster is going to go after what it can in an attempt to help.
Yeah.
And it just oversteps sometimes.
Yeah.
So once again, we get to decide how to respond to it. But we also get to be kind to ourselves when anxiety is really trying to yell at us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that self-compassion maybe in terms of that second question, which is, presenting anxious versus those who have anxiety, even just the verbiage of I'm feeling anxious versus I have anxiety. I think there's a definite power in our words. And in some ways, there is no difference in whether clinical anxiety or anxiety, but I feel like sometimes it can right size how big it is too for different scenarios.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so everybody has anxiety, right? Like Lora was saying, it's adaptive. Yeah, it's healthy. It helps us fight or flight. It helps us when there's a real threat, when there's a danger. And everybody has anxiety to some degree, right? Like, so, public speaking, taking tests, whatever, that helps you study, it helps you prepare, all of that. I think for us, it becomes more clinical when it's really disruptive and interfering with the person's life.
Yeah.
Right? So we look at how long is the person studying? How are they sleeping? Are they eating? Are they able to engage socially? Do they have time to engage socially? Do they, are they avoiding anything that they should be doing? We look at like, what is an average child or teen doing, and what is this person doing, and how different is it, and how much is it interfering with their life?
That impact.
Right? And so, for the kids where it's really obvious because they're avoiding or they're having meltdowns or tantrums, it's pretty obvious. But I think a lot of kids go unnoticed, especially probably in the gifted population, because it looks good, right? They're getting straight A's.
Yep.
They're in 15 sports and excelling at every single one of them. And so you don't really recognize that might be driven by anxiety because the outcome is okay. But I think in both scenarios, it could be disruptive anxiety that's manifesting.
And at what cost?
Right,
right?
at what cost,
and that's
right.
such a family values thing,
right,
too. Because, yes, I will say, for the gifted profile, if top excellence, if top grades, if certain just, the first time you try something, you have the abilities that other people might have to work to
right.
get, that becomes your normal. That becomes like a very normalized experience. So when things don't come as easy, when things start to falter, when things aren't as routine as they used to feel, whether that's once we get to middle school because things have become more complex and now there's a whole social scene that we have to start interpreting because communication is much more indirect. We're carrying all that extra stress with us as we walk into science class to take our test versus when things were a lot more black and white in lower school. Sometimes that's kind of the tipping point where you'll see that transition. Sometimes it's high school. Sometimes, like we know, it's college and life skills that sometimes students don't have, yet they have other abilities that are far above and beyond their age. So, and I think too, if we take all of those large, beautiful results, the straight A's, in the drama, in band, in sports, and they become the identity of the kid because they're reinforced so strong and it's I am this. If those start to falter, that's a huge hit to the person too, because that's who I am versus those are outcomes of my hard work or those are outcomes of my great abilities.
I think we'd also be remiss if we didn't really acknowledge some of the environmental pieces to this.
Yeah.
Social media is huge when it comes to, I think it's a double-edged sword that we're seeing right now, which is that we can normalize some of these things that are going on as far as anxiety is concerned. They're seeing things on social media and saying, hey, that's me. And in a way, it's validating and it's normalizing, right? It's also, though, we have to watch that line that you're talking about of that I am this thing rather than I'm struggling with this thing right now. Recovery is possible. Right. Treatment is available. Yeah. These symptoms are manageable, right? And so it's something that I think parents and teachers teachers can be aware of, that there's a lot of the social media nomenclature almost that's out there and really does infiltrate students, day to days.
Yeah. And adults too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And not having, the compassion I have for kids who this is their norm and this is all they know is tremendous. Having not any smartphones, anything growing up through all the developmental years.
I can't even picture it sometimes.
Right. Okay, so we've mentioned, various ways anxiety can manifest in our students, which gives us clues to look for while supporting our students. But I'd love to explore the concept of kind of that spectrum of intensity for anxiety, given that it's a healthy response that we all have. So kind of what we've talked about in terms of it being a healthy, it's what prompts us to study for a test. Getting on an airplane, I kind of want the pilot to have some level of anxiety. Like I want them to be alert, right? We want surgeons to have a level of anxiety alertness. However, obviously we need to be able to channel that into high performance for those sorts of jobs. So it's difficult for teachers, parents, caregivers to determine like that typical worry versus clinical worry. And I know we've talked about that before in the sense of clinical anxiety versus not. But I think it's such a huge piece when we're trying to figure out when to intervene, how much to intervene. I know these are questions that parents will often ask me. And then as teachers have the spectrum in their classroom, what are typical signs of adolescence? What's in the typical norm? And being in a gifted school, our typical norm might be a little bit different than, a non-gifted setting. But at the same time, they're all still good clues to kind of have.
One of the clues, I think, is my child avoiding anything? So, and what is their mood like, right? Okay. And so, avoiding in terms of like either going to school, staying in school, avoiding social activities, having a hard time with sleep, with food, having a hard time leaving the house, things like that is a big clue. I think in terms of mood, anxiety definitely, like Lora said, shows up. It could show up like sadness, isolation, staying in your room, not engaging in activities. I think those are big clues. Maybe in the gifted population, it might be like excessively doing things, overdoing things. So studying, for many, many hours where you're sacrificing sleep and eating or, doing just not having a lot of downtime or that sort of thing might be a clue. Okay. So I tend to look at like mood, avoidance, isolation.
Yep.
What do you think?
I absolutely. I like you mentioned, we see it as overdoing it as much as sometimes underdoing it, right?
Yeah.
Right. When it comes to things.
Maybe a lot of reassurances too, like reassurance seeking.
That I think is huge in the classroom.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that is important in the treatment setting, if someone comes in and says, okay, I would like help with this, maybe it's even that your child has just lost the fun or the joy that they used to have in doing an activity because perfectionism might have taken over, right? Now they're doing it repeatedly, making sure that it's somehow perfect or that they're fearing that they're going to be judged now. One of the things that while we're structuring it, putting together a treatment plan, we look at goals. And it's really an important family conversation when we're working with things like perfectionism. And we know that studying for hours and hours can lead to all A's, right? Why would nobody want to study for hours and hours? This actually is a conversation that we have with parents just as much as children. And understanding the other things that they're missing out on, the ways that this can be harmful. So when we're looking at goals for treatment, it's important to have the parents involved in that as well as the children to say like, okay, what do I want out of treatment then? Do I want to completely eliminate all these symptoms, which probably isn't very reasonable, right? Or do I want to enjoy this thing again? Or do I want to be able to set healthy limits around studying and being able to have an extracurricular or two, right? Like these are all really important conversations that go into treatment planning. Once we, say that, okay, this is at a clinical level
Yeah.
of worry or anxiety that we need to intervene with.
Yeah.
How much time is it taking from their life,
Yep.
right? How much time
Yeah.
are they spending worrying? What is it taking from them? Is it
Yep.
like,
So it might not be like avoidance definitely is one big thing, but if it's just the use of time, if something
Yeah.
is just so over indexed, we don't have time for the other things.
Right.
And it is super helpful when some of our teachers will give an assignment and they're like, ballpark, it should take you X amount of time. That has been really helpful then when I work with a student in terms of if they are really actively trying to, I keep saying right size, like give the appropriate amount of time for each thing. That guidance can be helpful. But you're right, it is hard because in the classroom setting, how much of it's just naturally reinforced,
Right.
in a counterproductive way, but
In the classroom setting, and I think for gifted students, sometimes even, I hope I'm not, if you need to edit this out, please do. But I do want to say that like at home, we need to make sure that we're modeling healthy behaviors as well.
Yeah.
The environment is the largest contributing factor for recovery from anxiety disorders, right? So when we are showing our children that it is go, 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 nonstop,
Right.
that we're always doing
Right.
something,
Yep.
we have to be cognizant of what we're modeling for them.
Yeah.
And we oftentimes see kids, who will come in and they will have absolutely packed schedules.
Yeah.
Like they literally don't have a night
Yeah.
where they just have some downtime, right?
Yep.
This is if they're okay with that, if they're handling it well, if
Right.
things are going okay, all right, they're
Yeah.
coping with it
Yep.
somehow then, right?
Yep.
Or they're into these things. But when we're seeing this in conjunction with an
Yeah.
anxiety disorder or clinical anxiety, then it's really important to remember that go, go, go mindset
Yep.
fuels anxiety,
Yeah.
right? It makes it really hard to take a breath
It
and to
does.
sit with
Yeah.
some of this stuff if we're constantly engaged in something.
Are you looking at my family calendar right now? Is that what this is?
No,
but
and that's the thing. I mean no judgment
goodness.
whatsoever,
No,
right?
no.
But it is something that we have to
It
be aware
is.
of in the treatment process.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
it's like a balance between complete avoidance
Right.
and then
Yeah.
overdoing it, right?
Yeah.
So we always want to look at like, what is average?
Yes.
Like what is average? Is like one extracurricular and one sport
Yeah.
average, or is 6
Right.
of each average?
And what I think helps regulate, right? What helps
Yeah.
regulate each individual of a family
Right.
and what helps regulate the family as a
Right.
whole. And I think too, there are like we can say like this is the ideal, right?
Right.
And then we all live in reality. And so I think also there's like seasons where there's 3 more extra soccer games this month or work really picked up for one of the parents and they're traveling a lot. And I think if your kids are older, it's okay to say like life for the next 2 weeks is not going to be normal.
Right.
This is
Yep.
not
Right.
healthy.
Yep.
This is not what, the adults in the house are thinking is good.
Right.
We
Right.
don't think this is good either. So we're
Right.
acknowledging it with you. Like this is going to be hard. After these 2 weeks, these are the changes we're going to make because sometimes we just can't. Or if
Right.
there's a sick family member and parents have to, the adults in the house have to
Right.
aid and help with that. Like I think there are those situational things, but just that acknowledgement. If your kids are old
Absolutely.
enough
Yep.
to acknowledge like life does get hard and overcomplicated and overscheduled. There's nothing we can change right now. Or if there is, then just
Yeah.
do that temporarily.
Right.
Things will be okay.
The communication is so
Yeah.
important because then they're also being able to watch you model
Yeah.
how you're modeling, how you're handling that then in this short-term period where things might be a little bit, wonkier than they usually are.
Yeah.
So that's an important piece to it. And I definitely want to point out that every child is very different.
Yeah.
Even within families, right?
Yes.
Child one might be just fine
Yeah.
with doing 2 activities after school every day,
Yeah.
right? And that might be just fine for them.
Yeah.
And child 2 says, "Oh, this is really overwhelming."
Yeah.
So it's important. It's important to listen to children.
Yeah.
And we can help, also understand like, all right, is it avoidance?
Right.
Or is it overwhelming? But it's
Yeah.
going to be idiosyncratic
Right.
for everyone that comes in.
Yeah.
We know anxiety fits certain patterns and
Yeah.
molds, and depending on the person, it's going to look different.
But it just brings such a good point of just the temperature of your family and the temperature of your home and where is that. And I think having this episode in particular kick off our school year was intentional because I think going from the summer schedule, summer routine into the school routine. Whether you love school, hate school, whatever, wherever you are in that spectrum, you're going to have a level of anxiety, whether it's that excitement, nervous anxiety because school is the best place to be and you can't wait to get back to it. Or if these past few weeks have been really, really, really hard for you or your family. And then any parents who are listening to walk your kid through those steps as they've transitioned to the school year. But usually, and end of September, beginning of October, we should be in a groove. And it almost seems like at this point, if you're still struggling to get in the door, you're still struggling with the school refusal point, or just getting into a new schedule,
Right.
new routine, new transition. And that's going to look different for a little one who's never been in a formal school setting before versus, one of our 12-year-olds who they get it by now. But this is a good time of the school year to be like, routine should be set by now. If you're still really struggling, that's a key thing to look at.
Sure.
Versus just allowing for that transition time into the school year.
Yeah, I think that this is around the time that we start seeing, an increase in parents calling and wondering, when their child can get help. I think it's just really important to remember that anxiety is very treatable. If you're seeing some of these symptoms that we've talked about, it is more helpful to intervene sooner rather than later. The research shows us that the sooner that we intervene with some of these symptoms, the better they will start to understand them and be able to respond to them, in a different way. And that's what it's all about, is changing the relationship that you have with anxiety to be able to respond to it differently. Anxiety can be there. We just want it in the passenger seat, right? It doesn't need to be driving.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And kind of when to listen to it and when to put it in the back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maha and Lora, for sharing some of your time and expertise with us. We're so grateful for this conversation to have you on.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So I wanted to end with a reflection question. So thinking of some of the student behaviors in your classroom, are there any behaviors that you are now viewing differently as you examine them through the lens of anxiety? And our call to action. So after you've identified a student responding in an anxious way, can you think of one way you can help that child approach the task differently? Or certain things you can say to that student to reframe it to help them work through that anxiety block they might be having while facing that task? We want to thank you for joining us in this space today. Please subscribe to the Gifted Ed podcast to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Stay tuned for our next episode that continues to unpack the complexities of giftedness.